Let's start off with sort of how has Japan influenced your work? You were living here in the late 80s, the bubble in Japan. You're working at Temple University, Japan, one of the most popular teachers we had. Obviously, there's influences from that time, lingered visibly in your work, and maybe you could discuss those.
Well, there's a big difference between living in a place and visiting a place. And visiting a place only generates tourist art. But living in a place gives you an opportunity to experience the culture and the people in a way that's much more profound. And I think that having the opportunity to spend 3 years concentrated teaching at the school enabled me to visit places around Japan as well as inside Japan to examine the diversity of cultures. And those are all cultures that were, not to use the word foreign, to any experience that I had had prior, specifically on the East Coast of the United States. And what more specifically than that was how being in Japan was tied to the experience that I had in Rome, of which the most important would be architecture. As you mentioned, Japan was going through a boom time during the late 80s. And there was a significant change of scale in architecture. It was going from a 2-story, 3-story dwelling scale to skyscrapers. And the one thing that was magical about the evolution of the city was that even with the change of scale, everything seemed to be made by hand. And I think that if there was one common denominator between the history of the culture, the hundreds of years prior to the time I was there and the time I was there, it was the traditional reverence for things that are handmade. So whether it was the initiation to various craft forms or contemporary architecture or fashion, everything had the feel of touch. And I think that that was one of the most important aspects to pick up from my time there. And I would relate that to my time in Rome, which also was, although towards the end of the 70s, there was both this love of architecture, which surfaced or resurfaced, I should say, and also a reverence for the traditions of handmade, things that are handmade, everything from architecture to food to fashion. So in many ways, there are a lot of intersecting areas, which makes it easy for me to examine the power that both of those cultures had on the 50 some odd years of working in sculpture and drawing.
Tell me a bit about bamboo. It seems that you have used bamboo in various installations, and bamboo is something commonly associated with Asia. Just choice in the use of this particular material. What did you see as the advantages of bamboo?
Well, bamboo was an accidental discovery along the way, and it was more specifically associated to travel. It was picked up during the time I went to southern China, to the Philippines, to Thailand, which was a part of the experience of being in Japan, having access to those wonderful places. But I remember in particular spending time in China and discovering what bamboo had the capacity to do as a building material, and relating that to the way in which bamboo was integrated into traditional aspects of Japanese culture. So that the various cultures that existed at the time I was there and still do relied on natural growth, in particular bamboo. And it was something that would not manifest itself in my work for another 10 years. It was an infatuation with the materials, in particular, what was going on with it in a very formal way, almost a religious or a sacred way in Japan, versus the very functional and practical way it was being used in China and the Philippines. But it would take another 10 years for me to figure out that it was a material that I could use.
Yeah. Yeah, because, people might not appreciate, but bamboo is commonly used in scaffolding when they're building buildings. You'll see all these workers scampering, tens of floors up on these what look like a bit rickety bamboo platforms, but they seem to do the trick. So, turning to architecture, what is it that fascinates you so much? I really do see architect out of your drawings. What fascinates you so much about it?
Well, architecture was always the basis of why I eventually went into the arts. Even though I had no desire to be an architect, architecture was the area of the arts that informed the work that I did. And also as a child, it had a profound impact growing up in Philadelphia, a city that revered its architects and its architecture. And ever since I was a very small boy of 5 and 6, building, not architecture specific, but building by hand with very basic materials was always a part of the process that I liked the most, drawing and building together. And the building eventually became architecture. And I was interested in architecture all through my years at RISD. And in when I went to Rome is when it really burgeoned into something much larger. But again, I did not know how it would manifest in terms of the more mature work.
Mm. Are there any particular examples of modern architecture that you really like in, say, Philly, New York, Rome, or Tokyo, you find particularly striking?
Well, I thought at the time when I was in Japan, when contemporary architecture was evolving as almost like a fashion statement within Japan, that was when I really started getting interested in the ability of architecture to define new spaces. And there was an entire new generation of architects that were blossoming at the time that I was in Japan. Also, paper architecture, or architecture that only exists on paper but is never built, was always a big part of the process as well. And paper architecture had always been big as a part of an architectural field. It was always something that I was attracted to, whether it was the Bauhaus or the Russian constructivists. But in Japan and in China, in the early days of that activity, even China was starting to re-examine what the Chinese cities could be. Paper architecture was a big part of it. So there wasn't any architectural movement per se, but I was fortunate enough to be in Japan at a time when architecture was becoming a very fashionable activity.
Right. Well, fast forwarding a bit, how did the pandemic influence the work that you're exhibiting at the TU Rome Virtual Museum?
Well, the pandemic was important because it compelled me to work in a very small space for a very concentrated period of time. And I had done that before. When I was a teacher at TUJ, I was compelled to work in a very small space. When I stayed in Rome, I was compelled to work in a small space. But really, the original small space was something that was initiated when I was growing up again, when my mom used to clear the dinner table at the end of the day and allow me to make drawings and build things on the kitchen table. What the pandemic added was the solitude and the intensity that compelled one to re-examine the primal push. Where did all of this desire come from? And I think the additional element of the pandemic was that the notion of fear. What does fear, which is something that we lived with on a daily basis, at least in New York City, how does fear impact what you do? The interesting aspect of what happened was that I was excluded from going to the studio for about 6 weeks. When I took the work that I had done at home over the 6 weeks during the pandemic back to the studio and tried to work on it in the studio, I couldn't do it. I was not able to continue the work. Then 3 months later, when I went back to try to finish up some of the unfinished drawings that I had started during the pandemic, I brought them home again because it was familiar to work on the kitchen table, and I still couldn't work on it. So that there were a series of conditions that were displayed as a result of the pandemic that once they were denied and I had a more normal living situation, I no longer had the ability to make the same type of work. So I am going back into drawings now and small sculptures that I made
So
during the
free
pandemic.
from fear?
Excuse me?
And now you're free from that fear that pervaded New York?
No, the fear is still there, but it's become something different. If you are afraid all the time, eventually you live with it and it becomes just part of the breathing process. So in terms of fear now, I don't use the subways, for instance, and I ride the ferry every day. But that's not a bad thing, and that's not really fear. Can always be afraid to go into the subway. But you live in an isolated environment. And I think that that's the issue that we face in a densely populated city, because you live somewhat isolated to begin with, even when there are millions of people. Isolation is not something that is far off in the mountains. Isolation is sometimes in the congestion of a big city, which brings me back to the reminiscence of living in Tokyo, which was a very densely populated city, but I, as a foreigner, felt isolated. When I lived in Rome, I didn't feel as isolated. I felt much more comfortable because there was a Eurocentric feel to that experience. But fear is something that we live with on a daily basis now in New York, to the point where the fear has become frustration. And when it becomes frustration, that it impacts the work even more. But working in the small space, which is something that I've always been able to do, is something that was nurtured as a child. The kitchen table.
So before your nightmare is coming to a close, hopefully there will be much, much better times ahead. So in closing, I wonder if you have any thoughts about your educational philosophy and any advice that you would give to young aspiring artists.
It's a very difficult one. I was actually thinking about that on the ferry, and I was reminded of the Chinese story about the young man who went away to war for 12 years and came home, and his father interrogated him and said, well, you've been away at war for 12 years. What are you going to do now with the rest of your life? And he had an organized timeline in terms of how much he was going to accomplish by such and such a time. And everything was pre-planned. The objectives were all pre-planned. And the father asked the son to stop and to live his life more like a cork in a stream, and to allow opportunities to surface and to not over-program your life, and to allow the stream to take you where it takes you, and find new ways of reinventing yourself. So the only advice I could ever give that makes sense, since I took a very circuitous route over these years, is to be more like the cork in the stream, because I think that it enables you to not over-program things.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts of your art and education and architecture, and best wishes. I hope the show is a rousing success.